Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm delighted to be here today to celebrate the Rage of Innocence with Dr. Kristin Henning and Dr. Bettina Love. Kristin Henning is a nationally recognized advocate, author, trainer, and consultant on the intersection of race, adolescence, and policing. She is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, and was previously the lead attorney of the juvenile unit at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, where she has been representing children accused of crime for more than 25 years. Henning is the co-founder of a number of initiatives to combat racial injustice in the juvenile legal system, including the Ambassadors for Racial Justice program and a racial justice toolkit for youth offenders. She is also the recipient of many awards, including the 2021 Leadership Prize from the Juvenile Law Center. Henning has written numerous law review articles and other publications advocating for reform in the juvenile legal system. Her book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, was just released in September of 2021 and is the book we are here celebrating tonight. So welcome, Professor Henning. We're delighted to have you. And we're joined as well by Charis fave, Dr. Bettina L. Love, who is an award-winning author and the Athletic Association Endowed Professor at the University of Georgia. Her writing, research, teaching, and educational advocacy work meet at the intersection of education reform, anti-racism, carceral studies, abolition, and Black joy. The aim of her scholarship is twofold. Firstly, to advance how the field of education understands and critiques the systemic and structural racism of education in the United States. And secondly, to advocate for abolitionist approaches in the field of education that seek new possibilities for educational justice. In the pursuit of making her scholarship a reality, she works with activists, communities, youth, families, and school districts to build communal, civically engaged schools rooted in the aspirations of abolitionist teaching strategies that love and affirm Black and brown children. In 2020, Dr. Love co-founded the Abolitionist Teaching Network, also known as ATN. ATN's mission is simple: develop and support teachers and parents to fight injustice within their schools and communities. In 2020, Dr. Love was also named a member of the Old Fourth Ward's Economic Security Task Force with the Atlanta City Council. The goal of the task force is to advance dialogue and form tangible solutions for guaranteed income. So I'm sure folks watching at home who are not already familiar with both of y'all's work know now, after hearing your bios, that they are in for a treat. I want to encourage folks who are watching from home to shout out where you're watching from in the chat. And if you do work in any of these areas related to juvenile justice, to the carceral state, to education, any of those things, let us know. You also, of course, can ask questions by clicking this Ask a Question box on the bottom right-hand side. We do love to hear from you and hear what you're interested in. But I'm going to get out of the way because I am very excited about this talk, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Love. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you so much, ER. Wonderful to be here.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. What a wonderful Thursday night to have a conversation around this amazing, amazing book that was a hard read, but it was a beautiful read. And Professor Henning, the love and care and thoughtfulness that you put into every story that you tell was just remarkable to me. So I just want to say thank you first and foremost for this book.
Thank you.
People might pick up this book and say, oh, it's an academic book. We're two academics. But this book is really not written like an academic book. It is written in a way in which that is compelling. It is written in a way that pulls you in with these remarkable stories. And you are meticulous about telling these stories and the details of these stories. Many of the stories in the book I know from the media, but the way you tell it with so much tenderness, with so much love, and with so much detail, is just fascinating and just a wonderful contribution to the field. So first and foremost, thank you. And I'm just so excited to meet you and be here with you. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much. That's an honor coming from you. I sit here with your book in my hand too.
Well, thank you so much. There's so many places to begin. I do want to say, folks at home, if you have questions, please put them in the Ask the Question. We will try and get to your questions if they're there. But I have a lot of questions I want to ask you around the book. And the first is around the whole state of where we in, right? I read these stories. I want to get into Eric. I want to get into how you write this book. I wanted to get into Jason. I want to get into all these characters that you bring up in the book that are just rich. But first, I want to just ask you where we are in the world right now, thinking about Kyle Rittenhouse, thinking about Ahmaud Arbery and Tamir Rice. Like, how do you make sense of the moment that we're in right now as you write about Tamir Rice, you write about the violence that is happening to Black girls in schools, you write about it so beautifully and with love and with care, and then you sit here a week and a half ago and you see Kyle Rittenhouse acquitted. Like, how do you make this?
Yes, it's a perfect question because I am on such an incredible roller coaster, right? So if you had asked me that question even 2 months ago, I would have said that I have like this renewed sense of hope, right? That the tragedy of the death of, George Floyd brought folks out in droves, right? Around this and, renewed interest among young people in activism and protest. And I was, excited. And then you get Kyle Rittenhouse. And I feel like we're right back at, the contrast between Rittenhouse and Tamir Rice is like spot on, right? In so many ways. You've got, literally the story of Kyle Rittenhouse is the quintessential adolescent development story in every way imaginable, right? Like here it is, the 17-year-old child at the time does the most, asinine thing, right? Crosses state lines, walking down the street with a rifle attached to his body, right? Goes into this, scene, thinking that he's going to save and protect, the businesses, which presumptively are going to be destroyed by all the Black people who come out in protest, whatever. That's an aside, right? But he goes out. What is that? It's a quintessential adolescent moment, right? It's impulsive, it's sensation seeking, it's responsive to what his peers are doing and what he thinks his peers want him to do, right? It is not thinking ahead to the long-term consequences. It's poor strategic plan. I could go on and on and on. It is everything we know about adolescence, right? But yet, his story, right? What is it? It's a story of white adolescence and how extraordinarily permissive white adolescence is, right? It's an extraordinary privilege to be able to walk down the street with that, rifle in plain view. Tamir Rice has a toy gun, right? A toy gun, and he gets shot dead within less than 3 seconds of the officer's arrival on the scene, right? And so, but we've got this radically different, scenario involving Kyle Rittenhouse. He's given a hunting license of some sort at the age of 17. He drove himself across state lines without his mother knowing about it. He driving without, at least at some points, without a license. His mother clearly knows about that. It just goes on and on. It's the quintessential excessiveness or permissiveness of adolescence to which Black children have none of. None, right? More than that, have less than that. They get criminalized for just being children playing with toy guns. So all that to say, you asked me how am I feeling? Probably my passion and reaction show you. I'm on this like roller coaster. We're right back where we were. But I hope, and that's really, I think, Bettina, the story that is not being discussed as much in the Kyle Rittenhouse case is that question of adolescence and his adolescence. And how his mother, we do talk about the tears, but both he and his mother desperately wanted the world to see him as just a child. His mother was crying, right? Crying when, she understood that he was being tried as an adult. How many Black children are tried as an adult? when, they absolutely should not do. So I can just stop right there. But that's my reaction right now. I'm a little discouraged, but I hope that by conversations like we're having now, that a piece of it, I mean, there's so much to talk about with the Rittenhouse case, but that a piece of at least gets around the difference in our understanding of adolescent development for Black children and white children.
Yeah. And that's that's one of the arguments that you make in this book is around the privilege of having adolescence, right? That's a privilege. And you give the history. I'm getting ahead of myself, but you give the history of how adolescence is created for white folks to have this for their children. Y'all got to read this book, but let me slow down. Let me slow down. I got questions. I got it lined up. So let me slow down.
Yes.
I want to talk about how this book comes about.
Yeah.
And you tell the story at the beginning of this 13-year-old student, Eric.
Right.
So I would love for you just to walk us through what happens to Eric and how that is this linchpin for this journey that you then go on.
Yeah. So Eric he's a 13-year-old child that I represented. On a Saturday night, he's watching a movie. And in that movie, he sees someone make a Molotov cocktail. In his 13-year-old mind, he says, hey, that looks cool. Let me see if I can make something that looks like that. So he goes into the kitchen. He grabs a glass bottle. He begins to pour in a series of liquids without researching what a Molotov cocktail is, mind you, right? So he's pouring in bleach, pine sol, water, whatever he can find that's not going to be flammable at all. He then, this is my favorite part of the story, he takes a piece of toilet paper and runs it from the inside of the bottle to the out, closes up the cap. Now we know that this toilet paper is going to burn out before it even gets to the cap. But yet, he's a kid. He puts it in his book bag again on a Saturday night. He forgets about it. And on Monday morning, his mother drives him to school and he puts his book bag through the metal detector, at which point the security guard says, or the school resource officer says, what is this? He immediately responds and says, oh, that's nothing. You can throw it away. Right? He goes on to class, doesn't think anything about it. Next thing you know, police officers show up, fire department shows up. He's embarrassed, arrested, and dragged out of class. And he's charged with, attempted arson, like he was going to blow up the school. Actually, he was initially charged with arson, but quickly they got converted to attempted arson and possession of a Molotov cocktail. And that became 9 months, a long 9-month ordeal of him in juvenile court for the most adolescent behavior. Now, here's the kicker to the story, Jason, right? So some weeks later, I am giving a talk in Connecticut. And I tell Eric's story in Connecticut, and a white woman comes up to me and she says to me, my son did the exact same thing. I ask her what happened. She says he got placed in advanced science classes, chemistry classes to, appeal to his creativity.
Yes, his talents, of course.
Okay.
Of course.
So, yes, that's the beginning of that journey.
Yeah, but that is what is happening to our children. And what I love that you talk about, this is what has been happening for generations.
Yes.
To our children, right? Yes. This idea, I love that you talk about, the cell phones, the hair, the horseplay.
Yes.
Like, when do Black children get to be children? Right. And living in a carceral state, this is what happens.
Yes.
This is how it looks. But what you also talked about, and I think what I love about this book is I think oftentimes when we talk about, schools and the carcerality of schools and the carcerality of prisons, we leave out Black girls.
Yes.
We leave out the stories of Black girls. Now, what I love in this book is that you don't do that. You bring in their stories as well. And there's one story that's very dear to my heart and that I read a lot about when it happened. And that was in upstate New York. Those 4 Black girls, Black and Latinx girls who were seen as giddy and hyper. Can you walk us through that? Because I don't think people understand how carcerality works. I think people think carcerality is students fighting or students being disrespectful and not understanding like how inundated and in the fabric of schooling.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, girls, little girls, I mean, barely pubescent, right? 12, 13-year-old Black and Latina girls walking down the hallway, laughing and being giddy. That's exactly what was described. Really? That's what they're supposed to do. And the presumption was they must be high. They must be up to at the ages of 12 and 13. So they're taken, into, and I can't remember what it was, a nurse's station and strip search. Search to see if they had drugs or whatever on their possession. I mean, literally, again, quintessential childhood. I wouldn't even call that adolescence yet. Quintessential childhood. And it's just appalling the ways in which these girls are treated. And you're absolutely right. Trying to look back at some of the stories that we heard about and thinking about the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors, right, is one huge chunk of what I talk about in this book.
Yeah. I mean, it's just an incredible story that I don't think people understand, but you make it plain in the introduction. There are generations of Black youth who have grown up under the constant surveillance and threat of abuse by the police.
Yeah.
And the effects are traumatic for youth, their families, and the community. In many Black neighborhoods, police are parked on the corner, stationed at the front door of the school, and drive through the community at all hours of the day.
Yeah.
At night, asking young people to lift up their shirts to prove they aren't carrying the guns in their waist belt. Black youth are stopped and harassed by police for doing what teenagers do all over the world, talking on the cell phone, laughing with friends, shooting hoops at the local recreation center, flirting with a classmate on social media, or posting political views online.
Yeah.
Like, I love that because you just make it plain. They're just being children.
Yes. And more than that, like just being children in ways in which parents want their children to be, right? All of the things that we just list are actually important, essential to healthy adolescent development, right? So if you don't have a kid who, can go outside and play and tussle, if you don't have a kid who can't have healthy protests, whether it's on the internet or otherwise, how do they develop the leadership skills and the social skills and the intimacy, all of the things that make for healthy adolescent development and make for good, productive adulthood. So it's I think, even me, and I've been working with kids for years, until I really sort of sat down and did some research on the benefits of adolescence, the benefits of this stage, you sort of almost take it for granted. We take recreation and leisure and laughter for granted, but they're actually essential for healthy mental health, right? If you can't step back and take a break and laugh, even as a student who's burdened by, homework or whatever, you are in pretty unhealthy shape. And so it's just powerful. We want our kids, white parents want their kids to be able to go to the party, right? Hang out with friends, even testing alcohol, even, experimenting with drugs without getting addictive has actually been shown to be healthy as, a healthy experimentation to learn your limits. All of that. So anyway, yes.
You say on page 30, experts tell us that playtime also builds character and social skills. Then on page 31, notwithstanding the vast benefits of play, Black children are routinely denied the developmental advantages of leisure and recreation. Yes. While white parents encourage their children to go to the parties, make friends, laugh, and be creative with little concern for their safety. Yeah. Black parents like Shamir Rice live in constant fear that their sons and daughters will be stopped, arrested, or even killed for normal adolescent play.
Yeah, huge.
I'm reading that as a parent, right? I have twins. I have a boy and a girl. I have twins. So I'm reading that as a parent. Yep. And the burden on Black parents.
Yep.
It is a burden like no other. But what I love in this book is that we talk about the burden of Black parents all the time. But what I love that you do is you make it plain that it's not just about telling my child, hey, you know, when the police stop you, have your hands on the wheel. When the police stop you, make sure you're respectful. What you're saying in a very profound way is that it's not even about those incidents that we have as those entry points. It is about just Black children being children.
Yep, absolutely. Yes, it's so much deeper than just the basic survival, which is so funny. Your title, actually, until you just said it, right? We're trying to do more than just survive. It's not just surviving, it's thriving as children, as adolescents. Beautiful tie. I hadn't thought about that until this moment. It's absolutely right. It's really, yeah, right. Yeah, it's so true. Yeah.
So, but that leads me to really have this conversation around the discrepancies of what folks call the criminal justice system, right? This is the criminal justice system. This is not the justice system, right?
The criminal legal system.
Right. Talk about those discrepancies. I mean, we could talk about Brock Turner and you talk about Marcus Dixon. Like, talk about how we get these discrepancies and where they come from and how they are layered in our society, which then perpetuate into these structures like juvenile justice system. Like, just
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, to be clear, let me just say, we really want to take it back, something we've already alluded to, which is America has a long history of failing to treat Black children like children, right? So from slavery, when, you know, Black children were the property of the purported master, you know, moving forward to, you know, the civil rights era, you've got Emmett Till, who can be lynched, moving into the 90s with the super predator myth. And I point out those three eras, those three distinct moments in history, because it was in those distinct moments that some of the very intentional narratives about Black children get planted in the American psyche, right? Mm-hmm. So in order to justify the brutal lynching of an Emmett Till, you have to paint the Black child as a threat to white America, right? And then in the 90s, when politicians realized that they could manipulate race and crime to their advantage, we get the super predator myth, you know, latched onto as this pseudo-scientific theory that all Black children are gonna maim and kill us all. But those, I start there because those were intentionally laid, right? And then they live on long after the super predator myth is disproven. And so we have this narrative, and I'll be honest with you, Bettina, we know this, right? That even lives within Black folks and brown folks, not just white folks, but everybody, you know, has this fear of Black children. And so then when we talk about these structures, we see the disproportionate targeting or fear. It's always about the public safety narrative, right? It's not about racism. It's about public safety. But that public safety narrative is fueled by these biases that are irrational and manufactured, right? And so from the front end of the system, arrest, all the way through the back end, decisions to transfer and treat children like adults in the criminal legal system instead of the juvenile legal system. And so we've got, you know, Black kids, you know, you talked about already, you highlighted from the book, the ways in which they are over-policed, hyper-surveilled, the ways in which they are arrested and criminalized, not just by officers in a blue uniform, but by civilians. That's that front end work, right? And then in every single stage in the system, you see them treated differently, and that the racial disparities grow as you get deeper into the system. And so then you get, like, you know, a Marcus Dixon, who is, you know, tried and treated like an adult, or Khalif Browder, who's tried and treated like an adult. All of these kids who are, you know, essentially adultified for doing, you know, and actually in Khalif's case, there's plenty of evidence that he didn't do it at all, and then with Marcus Dixon, there's consensual sex. So the huge disparities in the way, even when Black children do commit crime, and I don't put Marcus Dixon in that category, but even when they do commit crimes, we have a way of treating white kids with grace and forgiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Y'all will remember the affluenza case where the kid, drunk driving, good Lord, right? Drunk driving, kills 4 people, injures 9, and he gets a residential treatment facility, paid for by his parents. You've got the girls who were, charged with murder for the Slender Man case, right? Who killed their friend, stabbed her, because Slender Man told her to. What did they get treated as? Mentally ill. And then Kyle Rittenhouse getting off, not guilty. And then you've got Black kids who go, like Marcus Dixon, going to jail for, he got sentenced at least for 10 years. Khalif Browder being held in jail for 3 years, awaiting trial. This is the difference. These are the disparities. And it starts with the intentional narrative, carries over into that subconscious narrative in how we treat Black kids.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, because that history, that framing is important so people understand. I think we're in it right now.
Yeah.
And so we're in it, and when we're the George Zimmermans and the Trayvon Martin, we're in it. But that history and that framing is very, very important so people understand this ain't new.
It's not at all.
This is not new. But what I love that you talk about in the book, and we alluded to it earlier, is this idea, and really walk us through, how do we get adolescence? Before I read the book, I thought adolescence was something that we did forever. Like, I was like, I didn't realize that was a part of the myth making of whiteness. So please walk us through that.
Yes, and
that was fascinating to me.
For me too. I'm reacting too, because again, when you start a project like this, particularly for me, I've been representing kids for 26 years. You go in thinking this stuff, and I got in. I'm surprised to learn. So I always, in my lifetime, I understood that we knew about adolescence as a distinct stage of life. But it's a relatively new concept that before the Industrial Revolution, we saw development in 2 critical stages, childhood and adulthood. But during the Industrial Revolution, when there's an increase in a need for skilled labor, parents, and of course, who are those parents? It's going to be wealthy white parents, realize that in order to prepare their children to enter that new market, they needed to pull them out of the farms, right? And into, extended periods of education. So we've got, increase in college enrollment, the establishment of professional schools. And during this period, we get this creation of adolescence. And actually, if you look at the creation of the word adolescence, or the use and the adoption of the word adolescence, it is not until the 50s and 60s that we see a radical increase in the use of the word adolescence. But so we have this newfound period of adolescence, which means for white kids, a privilege, right? And a privileged period of extended protection for young people, extended period of adventure, experimentation, extended periods of social and academic freedom, all of which are a privilege of white adolescents, while simultaneously Black children are not given any of that freedom. And instead they're, even, in the civil rights era, the 50s and the 60s, beginning to be criminalized and labeled and excluded, stopped, frisked, all of that. None of the grace and tolerance that was given during this period of adolescence to white youth.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
And this brings me to what you talk about in the middle of the book, talking about policing and trauma. Because everything that, I think, and this is why I love this book, and it's not this academic book, because you really hone in on the ideas that this does something. This is traumatic.
Yeah.
This is traumatic.
Yep.
And so you start to talk about like the over policing and the policing in schools, and you use your client Kevin to really talk about how the trauma plays out. And I think that
Yes.
oftentimes when we're having these conversations and we're talking about statistics and numbers and data and theories,
Yeah.
people get lost. And these are children.
Yes.
These are young folk
Yes.
who have emotions, who are real. And I love that you bring in that piece. So just talk a bit about just what it means emotionally and the trauma and the pain of this idea of policing. And you talk about the collateral damage of it.
Yes. And I really appreciate your drawing out the notion of the stories, because very much it's the story. It was literally Kevin. All of the names, by the way, are pseudonyms, but literally Kevin who awakened my eyes in an absolute new way to what it means to be traumatized by police. So I'm going to tell you the story, then I'll tell you what we, learned as a result of that. So literally not too long before the pandemic, we get a call sitting in the office. We get a call from my client, Kevin, and he's asking us whether or not there is a warrant out for his arrest. And we thought it was a very odd question because we had just been to court with him the day before. Had there been a warrant, they would have executed it at that moment. And we could hear his mother in the background yelling, "Boy, you're just being paranoid." Well, it turns out he had been sitting in his window. He could see a police car with 2 officers parked in front of his building for over 2 hours. He was convinced that those officers were out there waiting for him. And I realized this boy is not paranoid. He's traumatized, right? This is a client that I had been representing for over 3 years. He had been stopped no less than 50 times, the vast majority of which for nothing that, for not having done anything wrong at all. So he was traumatized. And so I began to do some research, and there is a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that Black and Latinx youth in particular experience in relationship to police. So what the research shows is that children, Black and brown children who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods, who are the frequent targets of police stops, experience high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hypervigilant, meaning that they're always on guard, not trusting adults. And a lot of that distrusting police officers, and a lot of that distrust towards police officers is transferred to other adult figures, right? Including teachers and counselors, people who could be potential allies, right? And so it has an extraordinary collateral impact on adolescent identity formation, which is one of the most important things that happens during adolescence. It's when children begin to figure out who they are, who they want to be, and who they are in relationship to other people. So they're constantly being told through these negative police encounters that they're bad, that they're criminal. Has a profound impact on adolescent identity development. And then another area of collateral impact is, adolescence is a time when our views about law and law enforcement become firmly fixed in our heads, right? And they have a profound impact on how we will relate to police officers later in life, right? So early negative encounters with the police, leads to fear, resentment, and even resistance of police later in life. So it's profound. The trauma is real. And I will say one other thing about the trauma, which was really going back and revisiting these stories, pulling old police reports, pulling old interview notes that I had with interviewing clients, really for me was traumatic in a way that I did not expect, right? I found myself crying. I found myself having nightmares. And I kept thinking, if it's doing this to me, a year, 2 years later, as secondary and tertiary trauma, third layer trauma, imagine what my clients was feeling. So really traumatic.
That's heavy.
Yeah.
That's heavy. But I want to stop here because I'm listening to you and I'm just enamored by the way in which you tell the stories, the way in which you tell the stories mix with the theory, mix with the data, mix. I love a book that weaves all that together.
Right.
I love a book that takes me on a journey, even though it may not be a journey I want to go on.
Right.
But that's what I love about this book, that you take us on this very intimate journey into your clients' lives, to these young people's lives. But then hearing you talk about it is even a more of a treat, because the way in which the passion that you have match with the incredible intellect just is, I'm enjoying it. Like I'm learning and I'm enjoying it, and I'm thankful. But it's your voice, it's your work that is so important to help us as a country, to help us as a nation, to frame these things for us. So we get to understand. I think we're at a moment in our country where we understand, like, the criminal justice system is wrong, it's bad, and we're in that binary stage right now. But I don't think we understand what it means for children. Right. For children. We haven't really gotten there yet. And I do think the Khalif Broader story was a wake-up moment for us. But I think what you do is you expand that conversation in a way in which I haven't seen before, that we're moving just beyond that entry point to understand how young people are criminalized. But I also see this within, and you talk about this in the book, right? The Central Park Five, which we now know are exadulterated five. Right. And trying to expand and move that conversation is something that I just think this book does so lovely. Is we need it, in my opinion, looking at the field and seeing what's happening, we needed something else to say. Look, you all know those stories, but you don't know these stories, these everyday stories. And that's what is so fascinating about the book. Just tell us, like, what was your process of digging and retrieving these stories and talking with your clients? Like, what was your process, and how are you healing and trying to center healing throughout this thing?
Yeah, so that is really a powerful question, the question of the process and figuring out the stories. Because let me just say, I also lost sleep around the stories. So I unequivocally wanted to write this book to give voice to what I knew was not known, right? So giving voice to Black children to tell their trauma. But I was so afraid, right? Because it's their stories to tell, right? Yeah. And so I was in some ways the story keeper and the storyteller, but in order to be that, I had to honor those stories and to do so in a way that, didn't violate confidences, that, would not disrespect or dishonor, and think about it, even some of the Black masculinity, right? That gets challenged or pushed when you reveal the trauma. So I lost a lot of sleep. I was afraid, and I found myself thinking, well, if Eric picked up the book, would he be okay with the telling of the story? If Kevin saw this, would he be okay with the telling of the story? So one, that was, a part of what was happening. I think the other part of what was happening, which was magical almost, was the ways in which the stories drove the research and the research drove the stories back and forth. So I would have literally probably, I think I knew I wanted to write this book for sure back in 2017. Right. There's Angela Davis put together a book, Policing the Black Man. And she invited me to write a chapter on policing Black boys. And from that moment, I knew I wanted to write this book. And I began to sort of compile an electronic file on my computer. This is a story that has to be told. This is a story that has to be told. And then thinking about Kevin's story, it made me research trauma. Right. So telling the story, folks will remember Jeremiah, who was in Brooklyn, in the bodega in Brooklyn, who walks through the bodega, his book bag hits a white woman's behind, and she turns around and says that he sexually assaulted her. If folks will remember that story, right? that story drove me to look at the adultification and sexuality. Did I lose you, or did I get lost in there, Bettina?
I don't know what happened. We froze, but
Right.
I'm feeling you. I don't know what happened, but we back.
Right, we're back. So, but you know, so anyway, I say that to say, literally, the most profound stories in my, you know, sort of history of memory, from the news as well as from my own cases, drove the research. And then the research, sometimes I would find this nugget about adolescent development, and it would drive me to, you know, to share, to think about a story of one of my clients. So I think that was some of the process. The other thing is, Bettina, what we've been talking about, which is the importance of narrative. And you know, look, I started off as an academic, and I have to give real kudos to my friends, you know, who were in my writing club, and they would read sections and they would be like, "Girl, you sound like a PhD who's trying to be hip. I'm gonna need you to be hip and just happen to have a little bit of intelligence." And so I'll tell you, I had to go back through that manuscript and like almost rewrite it, centering the stories and letting the stories drive the book instead of the other way around.
You got some good friends. You got some good friends then. You got some good friends then.
Yes. Look, I got to give shout out to my girl Andrea Dennis. She's in my writing club. She's from UGA. So
there you go.
Yes.
There you go. Go dogs. Go dogs.
That's right.
So
That's right.
before, I mean, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I do see that there's a question, and we will get to it soon. I have a few more questions that I wanted to ask you, because I really want to get to the idea of what do we do. And you talk about repair. You talk about how do we repair harm, and how do we do that. So what are some strategies that you think are important, or some approaches that you think are important as we understand what is happening, as we start to be critical of what is happening? How do we move the conversation? What do you think is next?
Yeah, so you know, at least regarding the healing part, right? So, and we can put that separate. We could talk about what to do from like the, you know, structural, legal, you know, systemic ends, but from that healing end, and that was really critical. So, chapter 12, the last chapter of the book, I call Black Girl Magic and Black Boy Joy. You know, the resilience of adolescence. That was another piece of research that was relatively new to me. I mean, I knew, you know, that adolescents were resilient. The brain is malleable during this period. But to really understand resilience, and from a Black lens, right, was really critical for me, right? And so this notion of understanding the science of resilience was a starting point. And so that, how do we cultivate resilience in Black children in particular, right? And one of my psychologist friends years ago taught me a phrase that I have just loved and adopted, which is that every single child needs one irrationally caring adult, and that children are better off if they have a team of irrationally caring adults. And so that's part of how we build resilience, both on the front end, during and after a disorienting or discriminatory encounter that Black children have, right? And so what does that look like? That's everything from the faith walk, everything from the recollection of Black achievement and Black history, the implanting of Black identity development, the racial socialization of Black children to be strong in the face of, in light of, you know, what will inevitably be these discriminatory encounters. And so I think that was, you know, sort of one space of healing, and creating opportunity for you know, for adolescents, right? When it's so deprived elsewhere, that we as a community have to really center joy and laughter and play and recreation in childhood. And I think, you know, a couple of other things that are important around healing is creating spaces for Black children to have these conversations about what it feels like. And I don't think we do that enough, this whole trauma conversation. And I'll tell you, Bettina, since I've been on this book tour, the most favorite experiences that I have had have been when I have been with young people, high school students, with young freshmen and sophomores in college, and I give them pieces of this book, and they are like blown away. This is my story. This is it. This is it. And I realize, wow, where have we created spaces for Black children to talk about policing as trauma? Right? Or the traumas of racism and this structured, in these, it's sort of these free-flowing ways. So I think creating that space. And then the final one is something that I think you certainly talk about, which is creating space for Black children to participate, protest, if you will, and in ways in which they've been excluded from the democratic process. Right. So, we talk about, we haven't talked about sort of the title of the book, but I talk about, part of the rage of innocence is the rage that every, Black child likely has when they're told over and over again that they're bad and that they're criminal. Right. So I like to say any child who has an ounce of dignity, an ounce of humanity is going to push back on those labels, right? And when they push back, they don't sound like, the reasoned dissertation officer, Mr. Officer, I don't, like the way or appreciate the way you've been treating me. Instead, it comes out like adolescence. It comes out as impulsive and loud and, and it gets treated and perceived and read as a threat, when it is just their way of expressing their feelings and trying to seek change. And so I think that the other piece of this healing is to create, all of us to create meaningful opportunities, safe opportunities for Black and brown children to speak out against these realities.
Thank you. Thank you for that. My final question, because you are a lawyer, is around this idea of what do we do with the laws? Like, how, that for me is, you don't get a chance to speak to a lawyer that does the work that you do all the time, right? And so there's this healing piece, there's this like spiritual piece, it's emotional piece, but then there's a law. Right. And you start to break down on page 329, like, how do we rewrite the laws? So just like tell us like how, so as people are listening and thinking like, yeah, the system is, jacked up. How can we fix the laws that govern this screwed up system?
Yeah, and I love that question. And particularly, I love that question in an audience that may well be non-lawyers in the audience, because I believe that all of us have a role to play in that by getting in front of city council, getting in front of state legislative bodies and advocating for these changes. You got to know what the changes are, right? So yes, please read the book and get some ideas. But here, literally, I start with the premise that like we've got to radically reduce the footprint of police in the lives of children, and especially Black and brown children who've been disproportionately targeted. So things like police-free schools, right, is a critical piece of law and legislation. And I always say to people, it's not as radical as it seems. Everybody wants to say, oh Lord, public safety, fear, is the driving narrative, but it's not as radical as it seems at all. The question has to be, what is it that we want? And this is really important for all of us thinking about whatever legislative question involving police. What is it that we want and need police officers to do? What is it that police are best equipped to do? And that's what we need to have them do. And then relieve them of all of the other tasks and responsibilities that we've loaded on them. Like, managing normal adolescent behaviors, like, managing school discipline in school, good Lord, right? Or dealing with mental health, mental illnesses, dealing with drug addiction. None of that should be within the purview of police officers, right? So I think there's that, radically reducing. There's other ways that I suggest. We have to stop the practice of consensual searches by police officers of children. So you talked about it. You mentioned that earlier when you talked about how Black children are being asked to lift their shirt so that police officers can see whether they have anything in the waistband, or being asked to consent, children being asked to consent to a full body search. I feel like most adults don't have the psychological wherewithal or the knowledge that they need to make a reasoned decision about whether or not to consent or not consent. Children even less so, because they feel forced and pressured. Black children even less so, right? Because a Black child who's approached by the police automatically feels compelled, forced to do, like we said, whatever their parents, whatever the police say so they can get home safe. So we have to abolish consensual searches by the police, right? So there's so much more. And then I would say like decriminalizing so many behaviors like disturbing schools and, disorderly conduct and adolescent aggressive speech, which gets titled threats, terroristic threats. I can go on and on. All of that has got to be decriminalized. So everybody who's listening out there needs to know what those laws are so that you can advocate that they be abolished. And then in the rare circumstances in which police do need to engage with young people, they need to do so in developmentally appropriate ways, right? So we shouldn't be handcuffing children under the age of 12. We shouldn't be using tasers and, dogs, to stop children, or body slams and pepper spray. Girl, I could go on and on. But that's just, look, there's a whole range of laws.
Thank you for that. We have a question in the chat. When people finish reading your book, what actions do you hope individuals will take to defend Black adolescents?
Yeah. And I think some of what I, would say in response to that is some of what I just said is about becoming aware. So I think, so starting off, it's, Brian Stevenson talks about proximity, like, that, I mean, it's just not, it's a, look, it's real, right? I think a lot of us, even those of us who think we understand the criminalization of Black youth, until you really get on the ground, right? And talk to clients and ask the right questions, or sit inside my client Kevin's house and look out the window and see, or walk with him and see how many times he stopped. And look out the window and see how many police officers are within, 20 feet of his house at any time of the day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that's number one, is getting proximate so that we understand the ways in which adolescence is being denied to Black children. I mean, I think it's really deeper than I think we knew. So I think that's a start. I think secondly, it's helping tell those narratives. And I mean the positive narratives, the Black boy joy and the Black girl magic, the really, one of my goals in writing this book was really the hope that every single reader, Black, white, blue, green, would see themselves in these stories. See themselves as remembering what it was like to be an adolescent or a child in one of those stories, right? Or to remember what it's like for their own child to be in one of those stories. And so I think part of what we have to do is shifting that narrative so that people see Black children as children. And the research bears it out, that adolescence looks like adolescence all over the world, not just in the United States, all over the world. The key features of adolescence. So I think that's part of it. I think it's being an advocate, right? Everybody, can do one thing. Figuring out, partnering with your local ACLU, reaching out to the local public defender office in your neighborhood, which sounds like, why would I do that? Introducing yourself and having a roundtable, talking to locals, school officials who are seeing and who are willing to acknowledge what's happening. That's the thing, right? And figuring out, right, what needs to happen. We've seen some marginal shifts in decriminalizing certain, things like disturbing schools in certain states, but that requires effort. It requires lobbying and advocacy from the community, loud voices, speaking up. So there are things, but I think the massive thing, the hardest thing, is that cultural shift. So we've got to tell the stories that remind folks that you would never allow your own child to be treated the way Black children are treated.
Yeah, thank you for that. The last question I want to ask you before we ask ER to come back. I think the one thing that I really enjoyed about your book, and it's a really difficult topic, but I think you are so well suited to help us through, is just this week we had a school shooting.
Right.
And the conversation is going to be, we need more police in schools.
That's right. That's right.
The conversation is going to be, we have to get tougher on these young people, right?
Yeah.
And so as we close out, thinking about where we are as a country, and we know that school shootings which used to be rare, are now
Right.
common occurrence. How do you help us, give us language to be able to help individuals say, yes, we're not advocating for school shootings,
Right.
but we're still trying to make it known or say that police still shouldn't be in school?
Absolutely.
How do we come off something that's so tragic in our nation history that just happened this week, but not go backwards?
Absolutely. Yep. And that's exactly where I was going to start, Bettina. I mean, you framed the question dead on, which is we cannot repeat the error of history, right? Which is to, look, after every mass shooting, the federal government increased dollars for school resource officers in the droves by billions, right? And we still have not prevented school shootings, which indicates to us, right? What's the definition of insanity? Let's keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get a new result. So think about how incredibly powerful those federal dollars were in building the infrastructure of the policing in schools, right? And if we had in the past and we now do a pivot and reinvest those dollars, right, in youth, in families, and in communities instead of law enforcement, that would be the better and more effective strategy. And I think what happens over and over again, even when you get people who say, okay, I hear you, let's try reinvesting those dollars, they do it superficially. Right? They do it superficially. They don't invest in, they don't invest the adequate resources or time in making these alternative strategies work. Right? These alternative answers, a range of strategies, whichever ones you buy into, smaller class sizes, social emotional learning, positive behavior intervention, like any of them, people say, oh, they don't work. Have we meaningfully invested in them? Did we show true fidelity to the framework and to the model? Did we give them the money and the resources that they needed? Did we give them the time that it would take, right, to meaningfully do trial and error, to adapt them to the local community? And so that's what I would say is, like, we cannot let our policies be driven by these high profile incidents, these knee-jerk responses. And the school shooting happened notwithstanding the fact that there are school resource officers. And even back from Columbine, right? From 1999, there were school resource officers in those schools, right? Mm-hmm. It's just that, and they weren't able to stop the school shooting, right? And so it's not an effective strategy. And in fact, there's evidence to suggest that it actually increases instead of reducing crime by, really undermining a productive, welcoming school climate. Right. And exacerbating the trauma, causing students to not want to come to school. I could go on and on and on. But so, yes, that is every time we have a school shooting, I feel like we go back in circles around the same questions.
Yes. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the answer that we need. And I love that you said the fidelity. Like, people do this stuff so half-heartedly.
Yes.
That they want it to fail so they can go back to what they were doing.
Exactly.
It's like, that playbook is so played out. I know we are out of time. We're actually 2 minutes over. I just want to say thank you for allowing me to have this space with you, to spend this time with you. Thank you for this amazing book and this contribution. I hope you all check it out at home. I hope you all get it. I didn't put it down because the stories were so rich and so thoughtful and with love and with care. And just thank you for this amazing work. ER, I'm going to swing it to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bettina. You're phenomenal. Excellent. Thank you for all your work.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you both so much for this beautiful conversation. I think folks at home not only learned a lot, but now have some stories to go out and make change with just in this brief conversation, which is incredible. So folks, click this teal link at the bottom center of the screen to buy The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, directly from Charis. It really does help us when you buy your books from us. And tell your friends, tell folks at the local library that you would like your library to carry this book. Your kids' library, high school library. This is appropriate for a high school library. And you know, let's let young folks be a part of this conversation as well, right? So because it is obviously important, and we want to thank our friends at the Auburn Avenue Research Library for co-sponsoring tonight, especially Morris Gardner, who has been in the chat with us all night dropping resources. Thank you, Morris, for always holding it down with us, and thank you to everyone participating at home. Please do make sure that your book clubs and stuff know about this book too. It would be a great book club book. I saw somebody say that they were doing a book club read of this, so that's perfect. We love it when book clubs pick this up. So definitely make that recommendation. Faith groups, all that. It's always a good thing to get this into the hands of more people and help make it a success. But thank you, Kristin, so much for being here. Bettina, thank you as always. We love love having you here. And I hope, Kristin, that the book continues to be a great success.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Have a great
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. It was awesome seeing you.